The first warning came as a ripple in the night sky, a strange shimmer that spread like oil across the stars. At first people thought it was just another aurora, a beautiful quirk of the atmosphere. Children in the cities pointed upward, laughing, while parents fumbled for their phones to record the sight. But then the shimmer cracked, splitting apart like broken glass, and from that wound in space emerged the warships of the Zir Dominion. They did not come in silence. Their engines howled like storms, their cannons already glowing with deadly light. The first shots came before anyone could even scream. Green fire rained down from orbit, striking the oceans and cities in bursts that flattened everything in seconds. New York vanished in a column of light. Mumbai's skyline melted as though the sun itself had fallen onto it. Lagos turned to ash under the weight of plasma storms. In less than an hour, the proudest cities of Earth were gone. The world trembled, caught between disbelief and terror. Humanity had known for years that aliens existed. A few scattered explorers, strange encounters in the deep dark of space, whispers of trade and war in distant systems. But never had they expected the aliens to come here, to Earth, with such cruelty and purpose. The Zir Dominion were not conquerors in the way old empires had been on Earth. They were harvesters. To them, planets were not homes but supplies. They came for water, for minerals, for the rare and hidden cores of worlds. And the creatures who lived on those worlds were nothing but pests. Cunning pests perhaps, but pests all the same. Against their weapons, humanity had little to offer. The United Earth Fleet scrambled to meet them, hundreds of ships rising in desperate defense. But compared to the Dominion's war machines, human vessels were fragile toys. One by one, those ships were plucked from the sky, torn apart in a rain of fire. Earth, for all its courage, stood on the edge of final silence. Yet fate is never simple. What the Zir did not understand, what they had forgotten or never cared to learn, was that humanity was not alone. Decades ago, in the early days of warp exploration, a human ship had stumbled into a dying battle far from home. The Trelkith, a race of insectoid beings with crystalline shells, had been fighting extinction. Their enemy had cornered them, their fleets shattered, their last colonies aflame. Humanity had no obligation to help, but the captain of that small, fragile ship made a choice. They fought with all they had, using weapons barely advanced enough to scratch the enemy armor. They used trickery, feints, and desperation, and somehow impossibly they bought enough time for the Trelkith to rally and escape. The Trelkith had never forgotten. To their kind, a favor owed was a bond deeper than blood. They had sworn across stars and generations that should Earth ever face annihilation, the Trelkith would answer. As Earth's skies burned and the oceans boiled, the promise was fulfilled. From the far edges of space, another ripple tore open, but this time it was not death that came through. Trelkith warships emerged in shimmering light, their hulls gleaming like shards of glass caught in a sunrise. Hundreds of them, faster and sharper than the Dominion's dark steel, formed up in the sky above Earth. Their voices carried across every human frequency, resonant and strange but filled with fire. Human allies, their fleet commander declared, the sound echoing in every headset, every radio, every command station left standing. Today, the debt is paid. In that single moment, hope was reborn. Humanity was bruised, bleeding, and on the edge of collapse, but it was no longer alone. The world, which had seemed small and fragile under the shadow of alien war, now stood side by side with allies who owed them life itself. And for the first time since the skies had cracked open, the fire of resistance burned bright. Captain Elena Merrick stood on the bridge of the UES Resolute, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. The stars beyond the viewport were littered with the shapes of alien ships, their dark and twisted hulls crowding the night like an endless swarm. Earth's last fleet hovered in broken formation around her, scarred and weary from battles that had already taken more than anyone could count. 15 battered cruisers, each showing the wounds of plasma fire, 30 fighters, their pilots exhausted, their machines patched together with the last scraps of metal left in orbit. 2 heavy carriers, once mighty, now stripped and desperate. That was all that remained of humanity's once proud defense. And beyond them, stretching as far as her eyes could see, the Dominion fleet waited, numbering in the thousands. The monstrous flagship of the enemy, the Harbinger, dominated the view. A mile-long beast of black steel bristling with weapons, its surface crawling with parasite ships clinging like armored insects. It was more fortress than vessel, and it had already crushed fleets larger than hers without slowing. Her officers whispered behind her, their voices laced with fear they could no longer hide. "We can't win this," one said. His eyes locked on the growing red glow of enemy cannons charging for another strike. Elena heard him, but she did not flinch. Her face was drawn and tired. Her uniform burned at the shoulder where fire had touched it hours earlier. But her gaze stayed fixed on the holo display. She knew the numbers, knew the odds. Logic screamed surrender. Yet surrender meant slavery, and slavery under the Zir was worse than death. She breathed slowly, steadying the storm inside her chest, then spoke with a calmness that silenced the bridge. "Then we will make them remember us," she said. "Every last one." Her words were simple, but they spread like lightning. The comm system carried them across every ship in the surviving fleet. Pilots, gunners, engineers, and Marines heard her voice, and something inside them straightened. They had lost families, homes, entire cities, but the fight still burned, and somehow hearing their captain speak without fear, they believed again, if only for a moment. Elena's eyes returned to the display, where the Trelkith fleet now held position alongside them. Their crystalline ship shimmered in the light of Earth's broken orbit, jagged and beautiful, alien yet familiar. The Trelkith were larger in number than the humans, but not enough to balance the scale. Their weapons cut deep. Their hulls could withstand blows that would split human steel. But against the Dominion's endless tide of warships, even their strength might not hold. Still, they had come, honoring a promise made decades before. That thought gave Elena a flicker of warmth. Humanity had bled alone for too long, but now someone else bled with them. She turned to her second-in-command, a young officer with blood on his collar and fire in his eyes. "Signal all ships. We hold the line here. No retreat." He hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. Across the fleet, engines roared to life. Damaged weapons primed themselves for another round, and battered hulls turned toward the enemy like wolves baring their teeth. It was madness, Elena knew. But humanity had never needed odds to fight. It had only ever needed grit. The Dominion believed Earth weak, but weakness was not what had brought humans across oceans, into skies, and now into the stars. Stubbornness had. Stubbornness and the refusal to die quietly. And as the Harbinger's massive guns turned toward them, Elena allowed herself one last thought. If this was the end, then let it be an end so fierce the galaxy would never forget the day humanity stood against the impossible. The battle began with thunder that shook the silence of space itself. From the bridge of the Resolute, Elena watched as the first wave of Trelkith ships shot forward, their hulls glinting like shards of crystal catching the light of a dying sun. Their weapons flashed in brilliant arcs of violet energy, slicing through the front lines of the Dominion fleet. At the same time, human carriers opened their battered bays and poured out swarms of fighters, their engines flaring like streaks of fireflies against the endless dark. The void filled with motion, with death, with light and ruin. Elena gritted her teeth as her ship's railguns fired in a steady rhythm, the sound rumbling through the bones of everyone aboard. Each shot slammed into the Dominion's black-armored frigates, tearing chunks of twisted metal free, but the cost was immediate. The enemy's response came in storms of plasma, sheets of burning green fire that boiled through human formations and left nothing behind but wreckage. A squadron of fighters blinked out in an instant, their comms filled with one final cry before silence swallowed them whole. "Delta Wing is gone!" A voice shouted across the bridge, followed quickly by another. "Trelkith line is collapsing on the right flank." Elena's eyes darted to the tactical display. Explosions littered the field, glowing like dying stars. The Dominion pressed forward without hesitation, wave after wave of insectoid warships closing in, their numbers endless, their hunger relentless. The air inside the Resolute grew thick with smoke as another hit struck the lower decks, sending sparks flying across consoles. Crew members shouted, some limping from wounds, others dragging the injured away. But no one stopped working. Humanity had no luxury of fear. Every second of resistance mattered. Elena tightened her grip on the railing, feeling the vibrations of her ship's guns as they tore into another Dominion frigate. The Resolute shook violently as enemy fire hammered its shields, and alarm screamed as Deck 4 reported flames spreading uncontrollably. Still, her crew fought on, forcing damaged systems to obey through sheer will. They rewired circuits with bare hands, kicked failing consoles into life, and ignored the blood dripping from their own wounds. Humanity's weapons were not the strongest, but their people refused to surrender. Each moment of survival was bought with courage. Yet Elena knew the truth as her heart pounded in her chest. The Dominion's flagship loomed ahead, untouched and unstoppable. The Harbinger sat at the heart of the battle like a mountain of death, its parasite ships clinging to its surface, its monstrous cannons tearing apart everything in their path. The smaller victories her fleet scored meant little so long as that beast remained. Her weapons officer turned toward her, sweat dripping from his brow, his voice almost breaking. "Captain, we can't hold them. We'll be crushed before we reach their command ship." For a second, silence filled Elena's mind, drowning out the chaos of alarms and the cries of her crew. She saw the flickering display of their dwindling forces, saw the broken hulls drifting past the viewport, saw the faces of her crew who trusted her with their lives, and then her jaw set, her voice steady and clear. "Then we aim for the Harbinger," she said. Gasps rippled across the bridge, shock and fear mixing with awe. To go after the Harbinger was suicide, but it was also the only chance they had left. Humanity's last fleet would not die scattered and forgotten. If they were to burn, they would burn reaching for the throat of the monster. Around her, her crew straightened, their eyes wide but filled with a fierce determination. They understood. The impossible was the only choice. And as the battle raged around them, the Resolute turned its battered hull toward the heart of the enemy. The order spread across the fleet like a spark racing through dry grass, and every human ship lurched forward into the storm, engines screaming as they drove toward the heart of the enemy. The Dominion pressed in on all sides, their weapons burning holes through the void, but the humans did not turn back. One cruiser, its hull already cracked open, rammed straight into a Zir destroyer, igniting in a blast that tore both vessels apart. Another, its engines failing, aimed itself at a cluster of escort ships and detonated its reactor in a final act of defiance. Every explosion carved a path through the wall of enemy fire, each sacrifice buying precious seconds for those who followed. Around them, the Trelkith flew with desperate courage, their crystalline ships throwing themselves in front of Dominion cannons, their hulls shattering into brilliant shards that glittered like broken stars before fading to dust. They sang their battle hymns as they died, a haunting cry that echoed across comms, filling human ears with alien words that somehow spoke of loyalty and promise. For every human ship that fell, a Trelkith ship dove into the fire beside it, refusing to let Earth's defenders stand alone. The Harbinger grew larger with every heartbeat, its shadow swallowing the battlefield, its colossal guns tearing through the fleets that dared approach. Elena stood firm on the bridge of the Resolute, her heart hammering as the enemy's flagship loomed ahead. The truth weighed on her shoulders. No weapon they carried could pierce the Harbinger's shields. Even the combined fire of the Trelkith and Humanity had only scratched the surface of that fortress of steel and fury. Yet in the face of certain defeat, she found clarity. Her eyes swept across her crew. Men and women burned, bleeding, exhausted, but still fighting. They had followed her through fire and loss, and they would follow her into this last stand. She drew a deep breath, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Overload the warp core," she ordered. The bridge went still. Her engineer turned, his face pale, his mouth opening in shock. "Captain, that's suicide." Elena did not waver. "Exactly," she said, her eyes locked on the Harbinger's monstrous form. Murmurs rippled through the crew, disbelief mixing with fear. But when their captain's gaze fell on them, the hesitation faded. One by one they nodded, their eyes hardening with grim acceptance. If this was to be their end, it would not be wasted. Humanity would not go quietly into chains or dust. The Resolute would strike a blow so fierce the Dominion would never forget it. Hands flew across consoles as the crew set the sequence, each keystroke a sentence written in their own blood. The warp core, the beating heart of the ship, began to rise in power, its hum deepening into a roar that shook the walls. Energy surged through the decks, lights flickering as systems strained under the impossible load. In engineering, men and women worked with bare hands, forcing open conduits and sealing ruptures even as the heat burned their skin. No one tried to run. No one begged for another way. Every soul aboard the Resolute knew the truth. They had been chosen for this moment. Outside, the battle raged on, the last human cruisers falling like meteors, the Trelkith still throwing themselves into the fire. The path was narrow, carved in blood and sacrifice, but it led straight to the enemy's heart. And there, at the edge of doom, Elena Merrick stood tall, unflinching, her voice steady as she gave the command that would turn the night into fire. Humanity's last hope had become its final weapon, and the Resolute charged forward into legend. The Resolute surged into the heart of the storm, its engine screaming as the battered ship cut a path straight toward the Harbinger. Around it, the battlefield was chaos. Fighters burning in spirals of fire, Trelkith vessels exploding into shimmering shards, Dominion ships swarming like a tide of armored beasts. Human pilots, their fuel nearly gone and their weapons nearly spent, tightened their formations around the cruiser, turning themselves into a living shield. One by one they fell, their small ships igniting as enemy fire tore them apart. But still they flew, protecting the Resolute with their last breath. A fighter slammed into a Dominion gunship, vanishing in a brilliant flash that cleared the path a little more. A Trelkith frigate, its hull fractured and glowing, hurled itself in front of a plasma volley meant for Elena's ship, the impact shattering it into dust but saving the Resolute for a few more precious seconds. Every sacrifice carried them closer. The Harbinger loomed like a mountain of steel and hatred, its surface crawling with parasite vessels spitting fire in every direction, its massive cannons tearing through anything that dared approach. The ship's voice boomed across the comms in a guttural alien tongue, mocking, confident, certain of its victory. But Elena Marek did not flinch. Her eyes stayed fixed on the monster, her voice calm as she stood at the center of her bridge surrounded by sparks, smoke, and blood. "Warp core at critical," her engineer shouted, sweat pouring down his face as consoles blazed red with warnings. The deck shook beneath them, alarms wailing as another blast slammed into their side, tearing away armor. Crew members clung to their stations, some barely conscious, others coughing through the thick smoke, but not one abandoned their post. Elena raised her voice above the chaos, steady and strong, cutting through fear like a blade. "To every human, to every Trelkith still fighting," she said, her words carried across the fleet. "Fight harder. Humanity will not fall today." Silence followed for a moment, as though even the battle itself had paused to listen. And then cheers, battle cries, and vows of defiance filled the comms. Across the void, fighters dove with renewed fury. Trelkith ships fired with desperate strength, and the last of humanity's fleet drove forward as though carried by her words alone. The Resolute slammed into the Harbinger's shields, its hull groaning under the strain, sparks showering across the bridge. "Initiate overload," Elena commanded. Her crew obeyed without hesitation, their hands flying across controls as the ship's core roared to life, folding space and energy into a storm too great to contain. For one breathless instant, time seemed to stretch. Elena looked around her bridge at the faces of those who had followed her this far. Faces burned, bloody, defiant, and proud. She felt no fear, only a fierce peace. They were not dying in vain. They were becoming the weapon that would break the Dominion. Then the world turned to fire. The Resolute exploded with the fury of a collapsing star, its overloaded core tearing through the Harbinger's shields as though they were paper. The singularity ripped open, collapsing space-time itself, dragging the enemy flagship into a storm of impossible gravity. The parasite ships were torn from its hull like leaves in a hurricane, twisting and shattering as the Harbinger folded in on itself. For a heartbeat, the night blazed with a light brighter than dawn, and then the monstrous flagship was gone, erased in a storm of fire and silence. In that moment, the battlefield changed. The unthinkable had happened. The invincible had fallen. Humanity's last ship had delivered the impossible blow. When the Harbinger was torn apart and swallowed by the storm of fire, the battlefield went still as though the galaxy itself had taken a breath. The great flagship of the Dominion, the terror that had ruled countless worlds, was gone, ripped into nothing by the sacrifice of the Resolute and her crew. For a moment, even the Dominion ships seemed to falter, their lines breaking, their formations unraveling as confusion and disbelief spread through them. The impossible had happened, and their monstrous leader was no more. Across the human and Trelkith channels, voices cried out with joy and grief, a strange mix of triumph and mourning, for everyone knew what had been lost to achieve this victory. The Dominion still had numbers, still had weapons, but without the Harbinger, without the iron hand that had driven them, their assault lost its unity. The Trelkith seized the moment, their crystalline ships surging forward with renewed fury, their battle hymns rising louder than before. Human survivors followed, every fighter and cruiser that could still move throwing itself into the fight with reckless courage. Dominion ships began to retreat, some breaking formation to flee, others destroyed in a blaze of crossfire. For the first time since the skies of Earth had burned, the tide turned and the invaders were driven back into the darkness. When the last of the Dominion ships vanished into warp, Silence fell over the battlefield, a silence that felt heavy with ghosts. Wreckage drifted in every direction, broken hulls and shattered wings floating like the bones of giants. Among the fragments, pieces of the Resolute glimmered faintly, scattered across the void. There were no survivors from her crew, no bodies to recover, only echoes of their courage carried in the stories of those who had seen them charge into death with unflinching resolve. Elena Merrick's name, and the names of those who had stood with her, would live forever in human memory, carved into history with fire and sacrifice. On Earth's scarred surface, survivors looked up at the night sky, still streaked with smoke and falling debris, and for the first time in weeks they saw stars without fear. Cities lay in ruins. Oceans boiled in places where plasma had struck. Billions were gone and the world was forever changed, but it was alive. The Dominion had not taken it. The Trelkith, standing true to their vow, gathered their fleets around Earth, their commander's voice echoing across every channel in solemn respect. "Humans gave us life once," he said, his tone heavy with grief and honor. "And today, they gave us hope again. The galaxy will not forget what was done here." His words carried into the hearts of all who heard, sealing the bond between their peoples. Humanity had lost much, but it had gained something far greater, a place in the galaxy not as victims, but as equals, as fighters, as survivors. And so in the shadow of ruin, humanity rose once more. They buried their dead in silence, rebuilt their homes with trembling hands, and vowed to never again be caught unprepared. They had seen the face of annihilation and had refused to bow. The name of the Resolute became a beacon, a story told not just on Earth but across the stars, a warning to enemies and a promise to allies. Humanity was no longer a small voice in the void. It had proved itself with blood and sacrifice, and in doing so had reshaped its destiny. For when the world owed them a favor, they had not asked for safety or mercy. They had chosen to fight, to give everything, and in that choice, they had achieved the unimaginable.